The hearing room at Bagram Airfield was colder than the Afghan winter outside. It was sterile, impersonal, and smelled faintly of bleach and fear, mostly mine. I sat alone at a polished wood table, my uniform feeling more like a costume than a second skin, facing 3 senior U.S. Army officers. They were the panel for my board of inquiry, and their faces were carved from stone, impossible to read. It was a terrifying, profound silence, the kind that presses in on you from all sides. Then they called my uncle, David, to the witness stand. David, my mother's charismatic brother, a man who could sell water to a drowning man and make him feel grateful for the privilege. He wore a tailored suit that seemed absurdly out of place, projecting a pained sincerity that turned my stomach. In the gallery, my mother, Linda, a woman who mistook her brother's bottomless need for ambition, watched him with rapt attention, her face a perfect mask of sorrowful duty, as if she were the true victim here. David leaned toward the microphone, his voice dropping into a stage whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. "She's working with the enemy," he breathed. And I saw his eyes glistening with perfectly rehearsed tears. "She has the access, you see. She's got documents. Documents they buried to cover their tracks." My stomach didn't just drop, it evaporated. This was the knife he'd been sharpening for weeks, the final, elegant lie designed to sever my career and save his own skin. This was the end game. I risked a glance at my mother. She caught my eye and gave a slow, sad nod, as if confirming to the panel that my treason was a terrible cross she was forced to bear. There was no shock on her face. There was only validation, the final confirmation of the narrative she'd always believed, the one where I was always the problem. Suddenly, a hand went up. The senior officer, a stern-faced colonel with eagles on his collar, had silenced David with a single sharp gesture. The room, already quiet, became a vacuum. The colonel's gaze swept from my uncle to my mother, and then it landed squarely on me. In that one crushing moment, I felt the weight of their combined judgment. I was no longer Specialist Sharma. I was a traitor, abandoned and utterly alone, condemned by the only 2 families I had ever known. But this wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was just the final, public execution of a judgment my family had passed on me years ago. To understand how I ended up in that hearing room, you have to go back 5 years, to a Sunday dinner that felt like so many others. The air in my parents' house was thick with the smell of roast chicken and my Uncle David's cologne. He sat at the head of the table, a place that was technically my father's, and held court. My uncle, David, the family's golden boy even in his 40s, had a kind of reckless charisma that everyone mistook for genius. He told stories that always ended with him as the hero, and my mother, Linda, a woman who had spent her life living in her younger brother's shadow, would hang on every word. My father just faded into the wallpaper, a quiet spectator to his own life. On this particular night, David unveiled his masterpiece. He was starting a private logistics company in Afghanistan. "It's a patriotic venture, really," he'd said, swirling wine in his glass. "Helping our boys on the front lines, keeping the supply chain moving. And of course," he added with a wink, "the profit margins are incredible." Everyone leaned in, captivated. He painted a picture of himself as a swashbuckling patriot capitalist, a hero wading into the complexities of war to make a difference and a fortune. They saw a visionary. I saw a man who had never finished a project in his life, whose past was a graveyard of failed businesses funded by my grandparents' dwindling retirement fund. But I stayed silent. I had learned long ago that my observations were not welcome at this table. Then came the ask. "I just need a little seed money to get it off the ground," he announced. $50,000 should do it. The room didn't even pause. My mother immediately started talking to my grandparents about which accounts they could pull from, her voice filled with pride. It wasn't a loan. It was an investment in the family's designated hero. They saw it as their contribution to the war effort, a way to support the troops through their brilliant son and brother. There was no hesitation, no request for a business plan, no question of risk, only unanimous, beaming approval. Their belief in him was absolute, a faith entirely immune to facts or his disastrous track record. Watching them hand over their life savings to fund his latest fantasy, I didn't just see the $50,000. I saw the ghost of myself at 18, standing in this same kitchen. My internal ledger, the one I never spoke of, flipped open to a painful memory. I remembered holding my acceptance letter to a state college, my hands trembling. I'd asked for help with the first semester's tuition. It was $2,000. I was told that money was tight, that I needed to be more responsible, that it was time to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. That rejection was the reason I'd walked into an Army recruiter's office the next day. When I told my mother I had enlisted, she cried, not tears of pride, but of disappointment. All that potential, she'd whispered. What a waste of a smart girl. That was the false narrative of our family, the unspoken law we all lived by. David, the charming screw-up, was the hero whose risks were bold and whose failures were just bad luck. I, the quiet and diligent daughter, was the problem child whose discipline was seen as coldness and whose independence was an insult. My choice to serve my country wasn't patriotism in their eyes, it was an act of rebellion. It was me, once again, refusing to play my assigned part in the family drama. They couldn't celebrate my uniform because they saw it as a judgment on their own choices. Fast forward to 6 months before the tribunal. I was a specialist in the U.S. Army's JAG Corps, a paralegal tasked with preparing files for military lawyers. My life was orderly, precise, and thousands of miles away from my family's suffocating dynamics. One afternoon, a new case file landed on my desk. A routine fraud investigation into a defunct contracting company. I opened the cover, my eyes scanning the top page for the basic details. And then I saw the name. Patriot Solutions LLC. The air left my lungs. My uncle's company. It was supposed to be a cold case, but my hands started to tremble as I leafed through the pages. The reports were heavily redacted, black lines covering most of the text, but what was left was horrifying. There were mentions of missing fuel supplies from a forward operating base. There were records of payments to local nationals who, according to other intelligence, were ghost employees. Worst of all, there were flagged transactions, massive payments to suspected insurgents for local protection. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The new car he'd bought my mother, the expensive vacations, the endless stream of success. It wasn't from savvy business. It was from fraud. Dangerous, criminal fraud. He wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing fuel from soldiers in a war zone. He was paying off the same people our troops were fighting. My uncle wasn't a patriot. He was a war profiteer of the worst kind, and his entire life was a lie built on the back of real soldiers' risk and sacrifice. Staring at those redacted files, I knew they wouldn't see a crime. They would only see me, their disloyal daughter, trying to tear down their hero. I realized they would never protect me. So I had to protect the truth instead. That night, something inside me shifted. The deep familiar ache of being the family's invisible child didn't disappear, but it crystallized into something else, something hard and clear like a diamond. I closed the redacted file on my uncle's company, and in that moment, I made a conscious decision. I was done seeking their love. I was done trying to be understood by people who had no interest in the truth. My objective was no longer to win their approval. It was to uphold the oath I swore, to honor the uniform I wore, and to get justice for the soldiers my uncle had so casually endangered. My grief became my fuel. As a JAG paralegal, I knew the system, its rules, its forms, its language, and I decided to use it with surgical precision. I began to meticulously and legally request the source documents for the old investigation. There was no hacking, no backdoor dealing, just a specialist following protocol. I filed requests for unredacted fuel logs from a half-dozen forward operating bases. I requisitioned the original cargo manifests from supply convoys that had reported shortages. I cross-referenced dates, times, and signatures, spending my nights under the fluorescent hum of my office light, piecing together a puzzle of corruption, one official form at a time. It was methodical, exhausting work, but with every document that landed on my desk, I felt my purpose grow stronger. The receipts, when they finally came, were more damning than I could have imagined. I found a fuel log for a convoy headed to a remote outpost, a delivery that soldiers there had reported as being thousands of gallons short. And right at the bottom, in his familiar, arrogant script, was my uncle's signature. I found payroll records for local nationals, ghosts who had never worked a single day but had been collecting checks for months. That money had to go somewhere. The evidence pointed to one conclusion. He was not only stealing from the U.S. Army, but he was likely using that money to pay off the very insurgents who were attacking our patrols. My family's hero was funding the enemy. My flurry of high-level requests didn't go unnoticed. It triggered an alert straight up the chain of command, and a week later I was summoned, not by my direct superior, but by his boss. My heart pounded as I walked to his office, a cold dread washing over me. They got to him, I thought. My uncle pulled some strings, and now I'm the one in trouble. I stood at attention before the desk of Colonel Matthews, the commanding officer of the legal center, and a man known for his sharp eyes and an even sharper intolerance for incompetence. He was the same man who would later preside over my hearing. "Specialist Sharma," he said, his voice calm and even. "I've seen your recent records requests. They are specific. Tell me what you are looking for." This was it. I could either back down or risk my entire career on a long shot. I took a breath and laid it all out. The defunct company, my uncle's involvement, the missing fuel, the ghost employees, the potential payments to insurgents. I spoke without emotion, sticking to the facts I had uncovered. He listened intently, his face unreadable. And when I was finished, there was a long silence. "Continue your work, specialist," he said finally, "and document everything." That was all. No praise, no condemnation. But it was enough. It was a shield. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore, but I wasn't the only one who knew an investigation was stirring. Through his network of contacts, my uncle found out that his old business was under a new microscope. And he did what all cowards do when cornered. He panicked and launched a preemptive strike, feeding a story to anyone who would listen that his unstable, traumatized niece had gone rogue, stealing classified files to sell to our enemies. He framed my diligence as espionage. He thought accusing me of treason would bury his crimes for good. He didn't realize he wasn't just starting a family fight. He was launching an official military inquiry. And I had a 3-star general's worth of evidence ready for the main event. We are back in the hearing room at Bagram, the air so thick with tension it feels hard to breathe. My Uncle David's words are still hanging in the air, a poisonous cloud of accusation. "She's got documents they buried." He sits back in the witness chair, a smug, satisfied look on his face. He'd just delivered what he thought was the killing blow, and he was savoring the moment. Across the room, my mother Linda nods in solemn agreement, her expression a perfect performance of a betrayed matriarch. She looks at me with such profound disappointment, as if my very existence is a burden she has bravely shouldered for years. This was their moment of triumph, the public confirmation of everything they ever believed about me. Every instinct screamed at me to jump up, to defend myself, to list his crimes one by one, but I didn't. I held my breath, kept my back ramrod straight, and fixed my eyes on the senior officer at the center of the panel, Colonel Matthews. My plan, from the moment I found that first damning document, was to trust the system I had sworn to serve. My family had taught me that love was conditional, and truth was flexible. The army, for all its flaws, had taught me that facts were facts. So I let my uncle's lies hang in the air, knowing they would soon be incinerated by the weight of the truth contained in the binder on the colonel's desk. Colonel Matthews stood up. He didn't move quickly. He moved with a deliberateness that seemed to suck all the energy out of the room. Every eye was on him. He completely ignored me in the witness stand, and instead glanced toward the 2 armed military police officers standing guard by the door. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but carrying undeniable authority, "please stand by." A ripple of confusion went through the gallery. The colonel then turned his gaze, cold and hard, directly onto my uncle. David's smug expression faltered for just a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he straightened his tie, still confident in his performance. "Mr. David," the colonel began, his voice devoid of any warmth, "you are correct about one thing. There were indeed buried documents." My mother let out a small, audible gasp, a sound of pure validation. My uncle's smile returned. wider this time. An investigation into your company, Patriot Solutions LLC, was unfortunately shelved 3 years ago, the colonel continued, his eyes locked on David. It was closed due to what was, at the time, a lack of actionable intelligence to move forward. He paused, letting the words sink in, before picking up the thick, heavy binder from his desk. My binder. My work. My truth. However, he said, holding it up slightly, thanks to the diligence of Specialist Sharma, who followed protocol perfectly in bringing new, credible evidence to the attention of her command, that investigation is no longer dormant. The color started to drain from my uncle's face. My mother's brow furrowed in confusion. This was not how the script was supposed to go. In fact, Colonel Matthews announced, his voice like cracking ice, this board of inquiry into the conduct of Specialist Sharma is now concluded. He placed the binder down with a soft final thud. And a criminal investigation is now open. Based on the evidence provided, including logistics documents that you signed, Mr. David, I am recommending to the Department of Justice that you be charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, theft of government property, and providing material support to hostile forces. He then gestured toward me. Specialist Sharma is cleared of all suspicion. Her actions in this matter have been exemplary. He looked to the MPs. Arrest him, not her. Take Mr. David into custody. The colonel's gaze then shifted to the gallery, landing directly on my mother, who now looked pale and terrified. And Mrs. Linda Sharma, he added, his voice leaving no room for argument. You will be detained as a material witness for conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation and for making false statements to military investigators. The chaos was immediate. David's face, which had cycled from smug to confused to terrified, was now a mask of pure animal panic. He sputtered, "No, you can't," before making a desperate, clumsy bolt for the door. He didn't get more than 2 steps before the MPs intercepted him, his tailored suit rumpling as they efficiently secured his arms behind his back. My mother didn't scream or rage. She didn't make a sound. She just crumpled. It was a silent, complete collapse, her body folding in on itself in her chair as the entire world she had built around her heroic brother and her difficult daughter dissolved into a ruin of ugly, undeniable truth. And in the sudden chaos of their downfall, I felt nothing but quiet. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left behind in the wreckage. I was the one walking away from it. As I walked out of the hearing room, the chaos behind me felt like a distant storm I was no longer part of. I saw the military police escorting my uncle away, his face a twisted mask of disbelief and impotent rage. I saw them gently but firmly helping my mother to her feet. She looked small and broken, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own making. My fellow JAG officers, people I had worked with for months, looked at me with a new kind of respect. There were no whispers, no side eyes, just quiet, professional acknowledgement. As I headed for the exit, Colonel Matthews stepped into my path. I braced myself, unsure what to expect. He simply looked me in the eye, his expression unreadable as ever, and gave a single sharp nod. "Good work, soldier," he said. That was it. Just 3 words. But in that moment, they were everything. It was the validation I had spent a lifetime craving from my family, a simple acknowledgement of my competence and my character, delivered not with fanfare or emotion, but with the quiet, profound respect of the institution I had chosen to serve. It was worth more than 1,000 tearful apologies. It was real. It was earned. I realized then that I had been seeking approval from a bankrupt source, when my true value was being measured and recognized by a code of honor that actually meant something. I didn't need their world to accept me. I needed to succeed in mine. Later that week, my phone became a war zone. The extended family, who had been silent while I was under investigation, suddenly found their voices. The flying monkeys were deployed in full force. Texts from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years filled my screen. "How could you do this to your family?" One read, "Anya, your mother is destroyed. She loves her brother. "You need to fix this," said another from an aunt. They were a torrent of guilt, a fire hose of blame, each message designed to pull me back into the old dynamic where family peace mattered more than truth, and my feelings were the acceptable sacrifice. For a long time I just stared at the screen, watching the messages pile up. The old Anya would have agonized over them. She would have drafted long replies, trying to explain, trying to justify, trying to make them understand. She would have absorbed their guilt and made it her own. But I wasn't her anymore. Calmly, methodically, I went through my contacts list. With each press of the block button, I felt a weight lift. It wasn't an act of anger or revenge. It was an act of sanitation, of pruning dead branches, of choosing a quiet garden over a toxic jungle. It was the sound of a door clicking shut on a life I no longer wanted. A few weeks later, a new set of orders landed on my desk. It was a promotion to sergeant and a transfer to the U.S. Army's European Command in Germany. It was a prestigious post, one I had applied for months ago, long before any of this had happened. I had assumed it was a long shot, but there it was, in black and white. As I stood in my barracks room, packing my belongings into a footlocker, I thought about the two paths to success our family had offered. There was my uncle's path, built on a foundation of lies and a $50,000 handout from our enabling family. And then there was my path. This promotion, this new life. I had earned it. It wasn't a gift. It was a receipt for years of hard work, discipline, and ultimately, integrity. I didn't have to ask for updates on my family. The news traveled on its own. My uncle, David, was facing a federal trial with a mountain of evidence against him. His life as a charismatic hero was over. He was just another con man at the end of his rope. My mother, after being held for questioning, was released, facing lesser charges for obstruction. But her real punishment was social. Her perfect world, built on the pedestal she'd created for her brother, had been shattered. Their power wasn't just diminished, it was gone. They no longer had any say in my life, not because I defeated them, but because I had simply chosen to build a life where their influence couldn't reach. On the plane to Germany, I looked out the small window at the clouds stretching out like an endless clean slate. The peace I felt wasn't the triumphant thrill of victory. It was something deeper, something quieter. It was the profound calm that comes from finally aligning your life with your own values. It was liberation. I hadn't destroyed my family. They had self-destructed by betting on the wrong horse. I had just refused to be the collateral damage of their bad investment. My crime, in their eyes, had never been about treason. It was about seeing them for who they were, and choosing to be someone better. My family taught me that blood is supposed to be thicker than water. But the Army taught me that integrity is thicker than blood. If you've ever had to choose your own code of honor over the one you were born into, drop a comment below. Your tribe is out here waiting for you.